Those are the basics of kind of editing your mesh. But let's take a look at one other option we have in our edit mode here. You'll notice that the tool panel changed over here. Now your tool panel can be displayed in any window of any different view up here with the T button. So if I press T, it will pull those tools in, and you can see that they're context sensitive depending on what mode you are in. So here in the sculpt tool, that'll show the sculpt tools. Here in edit mode, it will show the editing tools. Now there are all different types of tools here. So what I'm going to do is show you how to use those on a basic cube. Now if you remember, I said you could add multiple meshes in one object. So let's show how that works. I'm going to come up here to edit, and then we're going to add a cube. And you may think that our sphere is gone, but you just can't see it because we can't see through our sphere. Now when you're in edit mode, you're likely going to stay in solid and wireframe mode. And let me show you why. So here's solid view. Now if I go to wireframe mode, we can see that our sphere is actually inside of our box. Likewise, in wireframe mode, when we go to select, we can actually select things on both sides. So if I rotate around, you can see that it's become see-through and it can select on both sides. That is one noticeable difference between selecting in wireframe and solid mode that can be difficult for beginners. So I'm going to go ahead, go back into solid mode here, and I'm going to select this cube. You can select an entire mesh by holding L while hovering over your object. So I'm going to hold L and hover over that, and then I'm going to move this off to the side here, and you can see that I have moved just the cube portion of my mesh. Now if I go back to object mode and grab these, you can see that I can still rotate these objects together because they're in the same object. So two meshes can sit in one object and work together. You'll notice that they rotate along this little orange point. That orange point is the origin, and that origin is what your objects will rotate and move around in. So if I tab back into edit mode and I select all of my objects and move them over, and then switch back to object mode here, we'll see that I can then rotate around that origin point. So that's something important to keep in mind. Again, if you're familiar with Adobe, this is the same thing as an anchor point. Let's go ahead and tab into edit mode again and look at some of these editing tools. Now I'm going to focus in on this cube as it's a bit easier to explain. I'm going to grab the face select tool, and we're going to look at the three most common tools you will use in editing, which are the bevel tool, the loop tool, and the extrude tool. We'll also take a look at the inset tool. So first of all, let's grab this top face here and look at the bevel tool. If I click the bevel tool here, you'll see that this little yellow bar appears, and if I drag this, it will create a bevel. Now if I rotate up and down on my mouse wheel, you'll see that it'll add extra edges in there to give us a smoother bevel. So let's go ahead and let go, and we'll see that now we've created our bevel permanently. Now what we're going to do is add a loop cut. So first I'm going to deselect everything by clicking off to the side here and pressing A. Now what I can do is come into the center here, and wherever I hover with this loop cut tool, it's going to cut in a loop around the object, assuming that it can make a full loop around the object, and then right directly in the middle. So if I go ahead and click here, you can see that it's created a loop cut there in the middle. If I click and drag, I can set wherever I want that. So I'm going to click and drag and set one there. Now we've created new geometry. You can see that we have new faces, new vertices, and new edges to work with. So let's take a look at the inset tool. So the inset faces tool is right here. So let's go ahead, click that. I'm going to switch to face selection mode, and I'm going to grab one of these faces that are now smaller. Now if I grab this bar and move in, you can see that I'm actually kind of able to change the size of this face that moves in. With there, I've created a smaller face. Now lastly, let's look at the extrude tool. I'm going to grab the extrude tool, and what this will do is extrude along that face. So if I click this and move upwards, you can see that it is now adding new geometry and extruding that face upwards. I can also extrude inwards as well. So let's go ahead, inset this face here, and then extrude inwards, and you can see that we've created a cavity. Now if we go back to the bevel tool and zoom in, we can click and drag this and add a small bevel inside. And if I deselect that and switch back out to object mode, you can see how all of that geometry has stayed in the mesh. Now, you may notice that we're able to see all of these faces, which would be kind of known as a common low poly effect in game development. But you may not want to see those faces. One way you can do that is by adding more geometry, but the more geometry you add, the more expensive it's going to get to render and the slower it'll be in your viewport. So let's go ahead and do a simpler solution. Let's go ahead and click this. We're going to right click Shade Smooth. So you see we have shade flat, which is what's on by default, and shade smooth. And you can see here that it's creating a smooth sphere. Now over here, our geometry is a bit more complicated and it's having trouble telling what sides to smooth. So we're going to give it a bit of extra assistance. We're going to come down here to this little green tab here called the Object Data Properties. Now normals are whatever direction your faces are facing in 3D. That may be confusing, but don't worry about that for now. You can always learn that later. But what you need to know here is that in the normals tab, if we twist it down, there's an auto smooth option where we can change the degree. So I'm going to check that on and adjust this. You can see how it's changing the smoothness of my object. I'm going to leave mine at the default 30 as that works fine for the look of this object. Now what I'm going to do is show you how to use a bit of motion. Animation is very complicated in Blender and 3D in general, and I've created a course on how to deep dive into animation. But let's look at the basics. Down here we can insert keyframes by auto keying. We have two ways of inserting keyframes. We can press I and choose to insert a keyframe on all these values. This may be hard if you're just starting, so let's go ahead and just take a look at the auto keying. Let's go ahead and click the auto keying here. Now anytime we move an object, that object will automatically insert a keyframe. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab the move tool and just move this a tiny bit to insert a keyframe. You'll see here that we have a keyframe down here. Now let's come over here to 100 by clicking and dragging in our timeline. And I'm going to go ahead and move this over here. Now I'm going to press this button here to jump to the endpoint. This will take me to the endpoint at this end, and this will take me to the beginning endpoint over here. Now if I click the play forward button, it will play forward and we'll see that our object is now moving in between. I don't want to accidentally insert keyframes, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off auto keying here. I'm going to start back at the beginning, and you'll notice that when I hit play, that this play keeps going past the animation. You may notice this light gray area. That's how much of our scene will render when we go to render and how much of our scene will play back. We can change that over here. So since I only have 100 frames of animation, I'm going to go ahead and change this to 100 by clicking and typing in 100. Now when I hit play, it will restart my animation every time it gets to the 100th frame. You may notice that these keyframes are highlighted orange. That's because they're selected. If I click in here, I can deselect them, and I can actually move these keyframes here. So I'm going to go ahead, click and select to drag this frame, and then I'm just going to click and drag to move that frame to 30, and that will make my animation play much quicker. So if I hit play, we'll see that now it snaps there in 30 frames. So that's a basic of how to use the timeline down here and how to do some basic animation in your scene. Next up, let's take a look at the layouts. I'm going to reset back to my default keyframe here, and I'm actually going to select these keyframes here, and I'm just going to hit delete and get rid of those so I don't have any animation in my scene. Next up, we'll go through all these different preset options we have here. So first up we have modeling. This creates a view mode that automatically toggles us into edit mode and gives us more modeling options. Over here we have sculpting. Now you can see here that we have all of our sculpting tools and it's switched us to sculpt mode. Now you may need more information than this. Now just like you press T to introduce a toolbar, if you press N, it'll introduce the information panel over here. And here if we click tool, we can see that we get a deep dive into our settings. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, you may be familiar with these type of kind of brush settings of radius and strength are the two that you're going to focus on the most. If I tab into UV editing mode here, we can see the UVs of our object. This is for when you're doing advanced texturing, but essentially a UV allows you to unwrap your object into a 2D view so that you can paint textures onto it. Which brings us to the next tab, Texture Paint. This allows us to paint onto our object, and here you can see that we're in texture paint mode selected up here, and that we can grab all of our different tools on the left. Again, if we press N and go to the tool tab here, we can see that we have various options such as radius, strength, and the color of the texture paint. Here we have shading. Now this gets a bit more advanced, but this is where we can start creating materials for our object. You can see here that we have the base color image added into our base color of the node here. We'll look at this node a bit more in a minute. Up here we have access to our files. Here we can view our images. Here we're in material preview mode so that we can view the material previews. And down here is where we can edit all of our shaders. Here we have the animation tab, which shows us our animation from our camera viewport and then a 3D viewport to animate in. Down here we have the dope sheet, which is kind of like an in-depth timeline. You can see here that under the keyframes we can twiddle down and adjust our scale, rotation, and locations independently of one another. Next up is the rendering tab. When you render your image, you can display the result here. We also have a compositing tab, and the compositing tab is a full suite of compositing tools within Blender.